And back. This is a middle perch. This area here on the internet. I'm MTK on the MIC Live. And today I cannot hear what's going out to you. I don't have headphones. These are wireless. Wow. And we're still digging up these tracks that I made. They're hilarious. Returning to the point at hand, I cannot hear the signal going out. So I could be horrifically loud. But looking at the meter, it looks not bad. I'm just going to trust that everything is cool. Today we're going to talk about wildfires in California and setting them on purpose as an ecological maneuver. And we're going to talk about, PG&E is basically now conducting roving blackouts. The situation in California power-wise and it was predicted. That's the thing, a lot of us, I don't want to. It's always just getting worse, right? Isn't that what's going on there? Come on, change your attitude, pal. I like these little tunes. I add some greenery to the scenery. What do you guys think about that? The greenery of the scenery. Yeah. I mean, it's been in here. I just haven't had it in frame. The middle perch can't be without greenery. I mean, it's healthy. And let's get into this. It's called Trailblazers. And this is by Twilley. This is from this past summer. And I am just going to assume that the levels are fine and read this thing, as it were. Trailblazers by Twilley, a new plan to solve California's fire problem. And this came out a couple of months ago. Before Terry Lim handed me an aluminum flask filled with a blend of gasoline and diesel and asked me to set fire to the Tahoe National Forest, he gave me a hard hat, a pair of flame-resistant gloves, and a few words of instruction. Quote, "You want to dab the ground," he said. Quote, "just try to even out the line." The line was a low ridge of flame, no more than a foot high, creeping toward us through the forest. In front of it, the ground was springy, carpeted with a dense layer of pine needles and studded with tufts of grass. Specks of sunlight shimmered in the deep, almost kaleidoscopic green, bouncing off lime-colored ferns and conifer boughs. A foot-long alligator lizard skittered in front of me, pausing to pump out a couple of quick push-ups before vanishing into the brush. Beyond the line, the ground was black and silent. Silhouettes of large trees loomed out of a sallow gray haze. The lit canister of fuel I was holding, known as a drip torch, had a long looped neck that emitted a jaunty quiff of flame. I took a deep breath and ducked my way through the scrub to the far end of the line. Then I walked back, dotting the tip of the torch's neck to the forest floor, a few feet in front of the flames, as if I were tapping out a message in Morse code. The dots and dashes ignited small fires, which joined up so rapidly that at one point I set fire to my boots. A swift, panicky battering with my gloved hands smothered the flames before any damage was done. The main fire was advancing into the wind, so it moved slowly and stayed close to the ground. But my new flames had the wind at their back and quickly jumped across the gap separating them from the original front, transforming the line's ragged edge into a wall of flame. It was mesmerizing and thrilling, and I couldn't wait to do it again. As the afternoon wore on, I began setting my ignitions farther away from the line in order to consume the forest faster. I started to anticipate how terrain would affect the pace of fire. Open stretches of pine needles caught instantly, but I learned to place my dabs in tight clusters near saplings and denser shrubbery. I wasn't really supposed to be setting the forest on fire. That was the job of the United States Forest Service crew, whose work I was there to observe. Their task was to carry out a prescribed burn, a carefully controlled low-intensity fire that clears duff and deadwood, reducing the risk of a catastrophic wildfire. But the crew were temporarily occupied by what they called a, quote, a slop-over event, close quote. A rogue ember had leaped across a trail that acted as a fire break at one edge of the burn, sparking a faker blaze so hot that standing within a few feet of it made my chest hurt. While the crew used chainsaws and hose to create a new fire break, it fell to me to ensure that no part of the line got ahead of the rest. If flames are allowed to break ranks and surge forward, they can whirl around and start running with the wind, burning more intensely and smokily than the prescription allows. It took the team more than an hour to fully contain the slop over. Then they returned to the line with their drip torches. By the end of the day, had set fire to 120 acres of forest. As Lim walked me out of the woods through the gray-gold twilight of the burn zone, he gave a satisfied sigh. Quote, "See, now that's nice," he said. Quote, "the trees have breathing room," close quote. The contrast between that day's prescribed burn and the uncontrolled blaze that the crew had rushed to extinguish epitomizes California's spiraling problem with fire. Throughout the 20th century, federal policy focused on putting out fires as quickly as possible. An unintended consequence of this strategy has been a disastrous buildup in forest density, which has provided the fuel for so-called megafires. The term was coined by the Forest Service in 2011 following a series of conflagrations that each consumed more than 100,000 acres of woodland. Megafires are huge, hot, and fast. They can engulf an entire town within minutes. These fires are almost unstoppable and behave in ways that shock fire scientists, hurling up firebrands up to 15 miles away, forming vortices of superheated air that melt cars into puddles within seconds, and generating smoke plumes that shroud distant cities in apocalyptic haze. Centuries-old trees whose thick bark can withstand lesser blazes are incinerated, and seed banks beneath the forest floor are destroyed. Without intervention, the cinder-strewn moonscape that megafires leave behind is unlikely to grow back as forest. 6 of the 10 worst fires in California's history have occurred in the past 18 months. And last year's fire season was the deadliest and most destructive on record. More than 100 people were killed, and more than 17,000 homes destroyed. Experts have warned that this year's fire season could be even worse, in part because record-breaking rains early this year spurred the growth of brush and grasses, which have since dried out, creating more fuel. Governor Gavin Newsom proclaimed a wildfire state of emergency in March. One second. A wildfire state of emergency in March, did Governor Newsom declare, months before fire season would normally begin. The tools and techniques capable of stopping megafires remain elusive, but in the past few decades, a scientific consensus has emerged on how to prevent them: prescribed burns. When flames are kept small and close to the ground, they clear the leaf litter, pine needles, and scrub that fuel wildfire, and consume saplings and low-level branches that would otherwise act as a ladder conveying fire to the canopy. With the competing vegetation cleared out, the remaining trees grow larger, developing a layer of bark thick enough to shield them from all but the hottest blazes. California's state legislature recently passed a bill earmarking $35 million a year for fuel reduction projects, quote, and yet no one is actually burning, close quote. Jeff Brown, the manager of a field station in the Tahoe National Forest, told me when I visited him there recently. Although prescribed burns have been part of federal fire policy since 1995, they've been part of policy. Last year, the Forest Service formed them on just 1%, some 60,000 acres of its land in the Sierra Nevada. Quote, we need to be burning close to 1 million acres each year just in the Sierras, or it's over, close quote, Brown said. The shortfall has several causes, but some 15 years ago, Brown set himself the almost impossible task of devising a plan for the forest he helps maintain that would be sophisticated enough to overcome all obstacles. Now he is coordinating an urgent effort to replicate his template across the Sierra Nevada. The Sage Hen Creek Field Station, where Brown is the manager, lies 20 miles north of Lake Tahoe in the eastern Sierra Nevada. It was established in 1951 to conduct fishery and wildlife research and is part of the University of California, Berkeley. Its amenities include a dozen radio-linked meteorological towers, snowpack sensors, tree sap monitors, and a stream depth gauge. It is not open to the public, but some 20 small red cabins are occupied by an ever-changing assortment of visiting researchers, student field trippers, and even artists in residence. When I drove there in May, there were still patches of snow in the shade, but the banks of Sage Hen Creek were dotted with the first buttercups of spring. I followed a rutted dirt road for a couple of miles through the forest, arriving at a simple shingled cottage where Brown lives, with Fairthen Felix, the station's assistant manager. From here, they help oversee the Sage Hen Experimental Forest, 9,000 acres of mountain meadows, alkaline fens, and pristine streams, surrounded by dense stands of Jeffrey and lodgepole pine. Brown, who is in his mid-60s, is a former competitive triathlete, ski patrolman, and river rafting guide, and he has the rugged look and expansive manner of a lifelong outdoorsman. When I visited, he was taking two filmmakers on a tour of the station. He led us out into a clearing and unrolled a map on the... I went offline. Am I back? It looks like I'm back, but I don't know where I kicked out. I'm going to go back to the top of this. We just talked about him the author visiting these foresters. Brown, who is in his mid-60s, is a former competitive triathlete, ski patrolman, and river rafting guide. And he has the rugged look and expansive manner of a lifelong outdoorsman. When I visited, he was taking two filmmakers on a tour of the station. He led us out into a clearing and unrolled a map on the forest floor. In the distance, three young does picked their way through the undergrowth. Behind us was a shed with an underground window onto the next door stream for the observation of spawning trout. Over the decades, dozens of insect, bird, and other forest-dwelling species have been studied and monitored at Sage Hen, and the station's records constitute one of the longest-running and most detailed data sets on the Sierra. Quote, we're the best inventoried forest in the western United States, close quote, Brown told me. As he led us through the trees, Brown pointed out that we were following an old railroad bed. Sage Hen was clear-cut in the mid-19th century to help build the railways and mines of the gold rush era. Sutter's Mill, where the first gold was discovered in 1848, is less than 100 miles away. After loggers felled the large trees, smaller ones became fuel for locomotives, and the eastern slopes of the Sierra are so dry that there are still stacks of cordwood left over from the 1880s. Nearby, Brown bopped up and down on pine needles that coated the ground. See this? He said. Quote, these go down 10 inches deep in places. So these are like thick beds of pine needles. When Brown and Felix arrived at Sage Hen in 2001, they saw their responsibility as straightforward. to keep this assiduously catalogued patch of wild Sierra forest unchanged for future generations of researchers. Only gradually did they grasp that the forest they had inherited was in terrible shape. During their first summer at the station, there were 3 big wildfires nearby, and Brown realized that all that dry wood and all those pine needles could easily go up in flames. Then, in 2004, scientists who had conducted research at Sage Hen gathered for a belated celebration of its 50th anniversary. Several had not returned in decades and expressed shock at how dense the forest had become. The local district ranger at the time was worried too, and asked Brown whether she and her team could help reduce the forest's fuel load by doing some thinning, something the Forest Service does either by sending in loggers with chainsaws or by using a backhoe-like machine called a masticator, which shreds anything in its path. Brown was horrified at the suggestion. Like many staunch environmentalists, he was suspicious of the agency because part of its remit is to generate revenue by logging timber like a crop. Quote, "To my mind, the Forest Service was the enemy because if you cut down one tree, you were doing something wrong," close quote, he told me. Elsewhere in the Sierra Nevada, conditions were much the same. Overstuffed forests, stripped of big old trees and filled with smaller ones crammed together, and global warming amplified the risk of disaster with each passing year. The average temperature on a summer day in California is 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it was in the 1970s. And in the same period, there has been a 5-fold increase in the acreage consumed by wildfire. Fire seasons have been getting longer and more severe since the 1980s. Brown realized that doing nothing was no longer an option. When the conquistador Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed 3 ships along the coast of California in September 1542 and became the first European to set foot in the state, he reported seeing a great pall of smoke drifting over the landscape. As the ethnobotanist M. Cat Anderson has documented, indigenous tribes traditionally set fire to the forest at a variety of intervals for useful plants, such as mushrooms or chia, and to minimize the risk of fire. Pre-contact California burned constantly, but rarely disastrously. In her book, Tending the Wild, Anderson writes, quote, "Legends about destructive fires reflect the almost universal belief among California Indian tribes that catastrophic fires were not a regular natural occurrence, but rather a rare punishment," close quote. In 2004, one of Brown's colleagues at Berkeley, a fire scientist named Scott Stevens, came to Sage Hen and took samples from the stumps of huge trees cut down during the Gold Rush era. Examining tree rings and scorch marks, Stevens was able to construct a record of fires dating back to the 1600s. His findings confirmed that in pre-colonial times, Sage Hen burned regularly. Those fires sometimes occurred naturally from lightning strikes, but they were also deliberately set by Native Americans. The consensus now is that the entire Sierra Nevada burned every 5 to 30 years. Quote, "The Washoe tribe used to hang out here in the summer and then light it on fire in the fall on their way out for the winter," close quote, Brown told me. Quote, "Especially near the creek. They wanted fresh willow shoots in the spring for basket making," close quote. At Sage Hen, some of the drier south-facing slopes seem to have burned as often as every 2 years. Not only did the forest's native species evolve to survive fire, several of them actually require it in order to thrive. Lodgepole pine cones do not open until heated by fire. Black-backed woodpeckers dine almost exclusively on seared beetle larvae. Brown began to see the outlines of an opportunity to reduce Sage Hen's risk of a catastrophic wildfire by working with the Forest Service and scientists at Berkeley to figure out how to implement burns. At the local Forest Service office, an eager young silviculturist, S-I-L-V-I, it's an interesting term, isn't it? Scott Conway was assigned to the project. When I talked to Conway, he recalled, quote, "Somebody told me kind of under their breath, Sage Hen is never going to happen and don't get involved." And of course, I immediately took that as a challenge, close quote. There were plenty of reasons to suppose that Brown's attempt would fail. One was the mutual mistrust between the Forest Service and environmentalists who object to public land being used as a lumber yard. After the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969, conservationist groups became adept at using its protections of threatened species and habitats as a basis for lawsuits to bring logging to a halt. In the early 1990s, The Sierra in Peril, a Pulitzer Prize-winning series of reports that appeared in the Sacramento Bee, spurred Congress to commission studies on California's forest ecosystems. As a result, the Forest Service revised its policies. To allow prescribed fire as well as thinning. However, the agency had very little experience in designing and conducting prescribed burns in the American West. The Sierra Nevada's mountainous terrain and dry Mediterranean climate make controlling even a planned fire challenging, and a century's worth of fire suppression had left forests so flammable that the smallest spark might trigger an inferno. Brown and the rest of the Sagehen planning team decided to pursue a strategy that had recently been developed by a Forest Service scientist at its Rocky Mountain Research Station. Affectionately known as SPLAT, S-P-L-A-T, for Strategically Placed Landscape Area Treatment. The technique involves clearing rectangular chunks of forest in a herringbone pattern. This compels any wildfire to follow a zigzag path in search of fuel, traveling against the wind at least half of the time. The splats function as speed bumps, slowing the fire enough that it can be contained, while allowing the Forest Service to get away with treating only 20 to 30% of any given landscape. The splat technique had been tested only in flat grasslands in Utah, and adapting it to the mountainous topography of Sagehen proved tricky. When fire travels uphill, it preheats the ground in front of it, often doubling its velocity. Fire usually moves downhill more slowly, but a lit pine cone rolling down a slope can easily ignite new areas. Topography also affects other factors that determine the pace of a fire, such as wind speed, rainfall, and soil moisture levels. Scott Stevens and one of his doctoral students embarked on a multi-year study to gather all the landscape data needed to model fire behavior at Sagehen. Adapting the splats to Sagehen's terrain took 4 years. Then, just as the plan was being finalized, a paper was published documenting the unexpected decline of the American pine marten at Sagehen. The marten, a member of the weasel family, is not endangered, but its population levels are seen as a useful proxy for forest health. Soon, the Sagehen planning team heard from Craig Thomas, the director of the environmental group Sierra Forest Legacy, which has a long history of litigation against the Forest Service. Thomas asked them to redesign the project with an eye to protecting marten habitat. Thomas, a small-scale organic farmer in his 70s, told me that he was astonished when the Sagehen group, especially the Forest Service, seemed open to the idea. Quote, "Instead of getting their backs up, they jumped in with both feet," close quote, he said. Conway recalled his own response a little differently. Quote, "I was like, really? It meant a bunch of complexity and making this project, which was already really too long, much, much longer," close quote. Still, as Thomas recalls, Conway, quote, "went away and read every marten ecology paper in existence by the time the next phone call happened. And I went, this is somebody I think I want to work with," close quote. So in 2010, the team, which had now been working together for 6 years, began planning all over again, this time with an even larger group of collaborators and a more expansive goal. Quote, "It started as science, but it became diplomacy," Brown told me. Quote, "How could we get all these people, groups that didn't trust each other, were actively suing each other, to a consensus on what was best for the forest," close quote. Brown secured grants, hired a professional facilitator, and brought together loggers, environmental nonprofits, watershed activists, outdoor recreation outfits, lumber mill owners. Sometimes there were upward of 60 people at meetings. Scientists from all over the region presented the latest findings on beaver ecology or the nesting behaviors of various bird species. To categorize sage hen's diverse terrains, drainage bottoms, with meadows and those without, north and south facing slopes, aspen stands with conifer encroachment. Working groups hiked almost every yard of the forest. Arriving at a consensus took years of discussion, but in the end, the strategy the team decided on turned out to mimic the way fire naturally spreads. For instance, fire burns intensely along ridges and more slowly on north-facing slopes. Martens, having adapted to these conditions, rely on the open crests to travel in search of food and mates, while building their dens in shadier, cooler thickets. Following the logic of fire would create the kind of landscape preferred by native species such as the California spotted owl or the Pacific fisher, a mosaic of dark, dense snags and sunlit clearings, of big standalone trees and open ridge lines connecting drainages. Conway then led an effort to formulate a detailed implementation plan whose treatments varied, acre by acre, according to the group's predictions. Some areas were to be left as they were. Some were to be hand-thinned, with a focus on retaining rotting tree trunks, and some were to be aggressively masticated and then burned. Typically, a Forest Service project takes 2 months to plan. Sage hen had been in the works for nearly a decade. But Brown eventually achieved the impossible. A plan that everyone, environmentalists, scientists, loggers, and the Forest Service agreed upon. Then, 3 days before the group was due to sign off on the plan, there was yet another hitch. In one of the units of sage hen that were scheduled to be burned, a Forest Service employee discovered a nesting pair of goshawks, raptors that are federally protected as a sensitive, at-risk species. This time, it was the conservationists who compromised. Quote, "I could have said, okay, this area is now off limits, and if you don't believe me, I'll sue your ass," close quote, Craig Thomas recalled. But after some discussion, he agreed to stick with the plan. He knew that burning might make the birds leave or fail to fledge young, but he told me, quote, "The collaboration effort and what we had accomplished together mattered more," close quote. When the Sage Hen Forest Project tested its fire regimen on 2 5-acre plots, the results were striking. A bespoke application of thinning followed by a prescribed burn reduced fire risk just as efficiently as the Forest Service's standardized splats, while also preserving more wildlife habitat and producing a higher yield of usable timber. The remaining trees seemed to respond well to fire too. Sensors that monitor levels of ethylene gas, which plants exhale when they're under stress. I didn't know that. Ethylene gas is exhaled by plants when they're under stress. Sensors that monitor that showed that the forest relaxed almost immediately post-burn. But despite the success of the project, enormous challenges remain. The Forest Service struggles to muster the resources and the staff necessary to burn safely. The California Air Resources Board restricts prescribed burns to days when pollution is at acceptable levels and the weather likely to disperse emissions from fire. In practice, this means that burning can only occur during a few weeks in the spring. In summer and autumn, the seasons when forests would burn naturally, the state's air usually falls foul of the Clean Air Act. These are also the months that are most prone to uncontrollable wildfires, whose smoke is far more damaging to human health than that from prescribed fire. But perversely, because wildfires are classified as natural catastrophes, their emissions are not counted against legal quotas. The window of time available for prescribed burns is further reduced by there are just a few days each year when the Forest Service can set fire, nowhere near enough time to burn at the required scale. Even at Sage Hen, large tracts of forest that should have been with fire remain untouched. When I made a second visit there and hiked through the forest with Brown and Fair Than Felix, he gestured ruefully as we passed through an area that seemed reasonably uncluttered. Quote, "We thinned this section years ago. We just haven't been able to burn, so it's a mess," close quote. He pointed a few hundred feet ahead to a couple of piles of spindly logs, 2 stories high. They represented another challenge. Quote, "These aren't big enough to go to a mill to be processed into boards. Ideally, we'd chip them and drag them down the road to burn for fuel and power, but the math doesn't add up, close quote. Traditional logging fells the biggest, most saleable trees, but those are the ones that Sagehen's strategy is designed to spare. Thing produces timber that has no value as lumber. Brown was resigned to simply burning these wood piles, but air quality restrictions had prevented him from doing even that. So the logs just sat there, increasing the risk of wildfire. Brown has begun working with a group of researchers at UC Santa Cruz to imagine the outlines of a timber industry built around small trees rather than the big trees that lumber companies love but forest can't spare. In Europe, small diameter wood is commonly compressed into an engineered product called cross-laminated timber, which is strong enough to be used in multi-story structures. Another option may be to burn the wood in a cogeneration plant, which produces both electricity and biochar, a charcoal-like substance used to replenish soil. Brown has also been talking to a businessman who hopes to burn waste wood to heat an indoor greenhouse aquaculture operation. His vision is to provide organic vegetables and shrimp to buffets in Las Vegas, and then to interest California's cannabis farmers in using shellfish dung-enriched biochar as fertilizers. Throughout California, creative efforts are being made to tackle the obstacles that have slowed implementation of the Sagehen plan and now hamper its replication elsewhere. Regional air quality officials have been brought into collaborative projects in the hope that they will permit more flexibility. New state legislation has allocated millions of dollars to hire full-time burn crews and will also require California's Air Board to quantify emissions from wildfires in order to reverse the incentive against prescribed fire. To help entrepreneurs build business plans for monetizing small diameter timber, Forest Service scientists are trying to quantify how much of it will be removed from forests. Across the region, the Forest Service is devising projects to thin and burn on the Sagehen model. Meanwhile, Brown has helped launch the largest forest restoration venture yet undertaken in California, the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. It encompasses an enormous swath of forest that extends as far north as Poker Flat, level with Chico, and as far south as American River, level with Sacramento. Brown's goal is to return fire to 750,000 acres in the next 15 years. Achieving this will require a radical acceleration of the process that took place at Sagehen. Scott Conway has been exploring ways of using artificial intelligence to synthesize satellite data and aerial laser imaging into precise three-dimensional maps of the more than 1 million acres that make up the Tahoe National Forest. With a grant of $100 million from the Moore Foundation and the support of Silicon Valley startups, he has begun work on creating an open access platform currently called the California Forest Observatory. Information that required years of on-the-ground counting and analysis at Sagehen, tree diameter, forest structure, fuel load, should soon be almost instantly accessible. Currently, the fire risk map used by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection doesn't include weather data and hasn't been updated to show burned areas since 2005. The prototype Forest Observatory will incorporate fresh satellite imagery on a daily basis. Perhaps Sagehen's most important legacy is cultural, persuading the Sierra's warring stakeholders to conceive of forest management in ways that they had previously rejected. 3 of California's national forests have recently mandated allowing wildfire to spread in areas where it will be beneficial. Forest Service employees will have to file paperwork to justify putting out a fire that has started, where previously any decision not to extinguish a fire was ground for disciplinary investigation. Attitudes among conservationists have evolved too. In July, I joined Craig Thomas, the former director of Sierra Forest Legacy, for a hike along Caples Creek in the El Dorado National Forest just south of Lake Tahoe. Quote, "I would take those out," close quote, he said, pointing at 2 lovely little cedars nestled in the shade of an enormous sugar pine, their crowns just grazing its lower branches. They posed an existential threat to the larger tree, offering fire a fast track up to the canopy, and a lack of sunshine and nutrients had left them stunted. Thomas, a man who once spent much of his time suing the Forest Service, told me that he recently became certified to operate a chainsaw. The Illilouette Creek Wilderness Area in Yosemite National Park is encircled by granite peaks that create a natural fire break. Because it is so unlikely that any fire could spread beyond them, the National Park Service in 1972 made the decision not to suppress wildfire within the basin's 15,000 acres. Since then, thanks to more than 150 lightning ignitions, almost every acre, excepting Bear Rock and the creek itself, has burned at least once, some in small pocket blazes, some in larger, more intense conflagrations. The resulting landscape provides a glimpse of what California's forests ought to look like, how they will look if Brown's sage hen strategy succeeds. In June, I visited Illilouette with Katya Rakhmatulina, a doctoral student who works with Scott Stevens, studying the hydrological effects of wildfire. On a 2-mile hike to one of 3 monitoring stations she maintains there, we passed perhaps only 150 feet of what most people would consider picture postcard Sierra Nevada forest, dark green, conifer-packed woods with a rust-colored carpet of fallen pine needles. The rest was a surprising patchwork of landscapes, rush-filled meadows crisscrossed with fallen logs, large sunny grasslands punctuated by a few big trees, copses of young pines and willows, and recently burned expanses where the ground was brownish-black, spattered with delicate pink flowers and adorned with carbonized trunks, gleaming and sculptural. Rakhmatulina was going to the station to rewire some cables that had been detached by bears. While she attempted to reboot the station's instrumentation, she told me about her research and the ways that fire affects groundwater supply. Having more trees in the landscape depletes water resources, like having more straws in a drink. Furthermore, pine needles and bark on the forest floor can form a resinous layer that prevents snowmelt and rainwater from sinking in and building up groundwater reserves. More than 60% of California's water supply originates in the Sierra Nevada, so anything that can preserve and increase that resource ought to be of immense value to the state's residents. I'm going to read that stat again. More than 60% of California's water supply originates in the Sierra Nevada. Brown says that he sees California's water utilities and agribusiness as future converts to his cause, and imagines a day when forest restoration could be paid for by a couple of extra cents on everyone's water bill. I left Rakhmatulina to her tangle of wires and wandered back through the basin. Long vistas extended in all directions, allowing views of snow-covered mountains. The forest felt more like a lightly wooded park. It has an average of 50 trees per acre, compared with the 400 to 500 that are typical elsewhere in the Sierra Nevada. And I began to realize that saving these forests will require a profound adjustment in our sense of what nature looks like here. The dark, dense wild forests of European fantasy translate in the drier conditions of California to a landscape that is both dying and deadly. But how many of us are ready to make that perceptual shift? The picnickers, hikers, and mountain bikers who fill the parking lots of the Sierra Nevada each weekend, and the wealthy summer homeowners who prize the privacy of Lake Tahoe's emerald shores, will have to learn to appreciate more open, meadow-like environments. Logging jobs that have been lost could be replaced by new careers in fire management. Californians will have to forge a new relationship with their forest and see the Sierra more as its native inhabitants once did, as a landscape that should be tended like a garden, rather than harvested as a crop or protected as a wilderness. That from the ecology section of the August 26th issue by Nicola Twilley on prescribed burns, Trailblazers and plan to solve California's fire problems.